last but not least, we have Sophie Teitelbaum.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Miss Aloria. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Before we get started, I just want to say I am a tad bit nervous. So just want to name it before we dive into it, because I think it'll help take away its power. And so I'm actually going to start with Albert Shanker. Does anyone know? Well, I guess it's on the screen. But Albert Shanker was the president of AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, for 25 years. And in 1988, he proposed having charter schools as sort of like a new type of public school. And the reason was to give teachers the ability to experiment and to innovate. And they were going to be publicly funded and independently managed and then looked at for a period of time. And if they were successful and teachers, flexing all their awesome teacher skills that everyone on this call has, then they would be able to continue those innovative practices. What has happened since then, particularly in the last about 20 years, is that this idea to create innovative schools has been co-opted by neoliberal ed reformers and the conservative movement to give more power to management and disempower unions and the collective voice of teachers. And so I think that's an important starting point to understand the root of charter schools, to also understand what's going on in New Orleans. And I think everyone from New Orleans set me up so well, because already you have so much more information about the New Orleans charter school system and how unique it is, which will allow me to better share my research and my take. So I want to give a brief history of the recent history of New Orleans public schools. You've heard a lot of this already. So in 2004, before Katrina, the Recovery School District was created to take over failing schools across the state of Louisiana, not exclusively in New Orleans, and turn them around. And so in 2004, before Katrina, they took over their first school in Orleans Parish. That's what you would call it a county outside of, like Broward is a county, Orleans Parish is our equivalent in that way. And so that's where we live and where we teach. August 29th of 2005, we had Hurricane Katrina. In November that same year, before most New Orleanians had even had access to come back into the city and move back into their homes, Act 35 was passed. And what Act 35 did is it raised the minimum school performance score for the RSD, the Recovery School District, to be able to take over failing schools, which meant all of a sudden the RSD had the access to take over almost all of New Orleans schools. And so 100 schools in Orleans Parish were given to the RSD to be taken over and taken away from the Orleans Parish School Board. And so what ended up happening between 2005 to 2016, I know there's a wide jump here, is that RSD, over time, I actually started teaching at a traditional public school under the RSD when I first started teaching in 2011. The RSD started closing a number of the traditional public schools and allowing charters to take them over based on school performance scores and other criteria. And so then in 2016, John Bell Edwards signed SB 432 into law, which we call Act 91, which is a really big deal and really important in Louisiana. And what it did is it was returning all of the schools from the Recovery School District to the Orleans Parish School Board to localize control again. And then over the next little while, the Recovery School District began to transfer schools back to the OPSB. And by January 1st of 2018, all schools were transferred back to the OPSB. How they got transferred and what all those plans look like and whose voices were heard and who was involved in that process is unsurprising and is a much longer conversation. But the basic gist of it is it was a lot of managers of charter organizations who were appointed and not very many voices from the community or teachers. And so by 2019, Orleans Parish School Board, OPSB, Orleans Parish, became the first all-charter school district in the country. And so many people look to us. I'm sorry, I have a dog who's about to bark, so I'm going to do my best to keep going. All right, so before we talk about that, I want to talk a little bit and define one of my terms. The term I want to define is equity. I wanted to put this picture up to start because I think when people think of equity, this is the picture they think about. And I actually want to name that this picture is actually not the definition of equity that I want to operate from and I want us to operate from. So I want us to have a shared definition of equity that is about, this is more individual based, and I want us to focus on systems and institutions. And so we're actually going to use, and policies. So we're going to use the definition from the National Equity Project. And so these are two definitions that they use. Educational equity means that each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. Another definition they use, which is also used by Zaretta Hammond, if you're familiar with culturally responsive teaching in the brain, is reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails, interrupting reproductive practices that negatively impact students, and cultivating the gifts and talents of every student. And so when we're talking about equity, we're talking about systems and policies that make this possible, not about individuals. So how do we improve equity? We need to address the systems and policies. So my question is, how has the decentralization of New Orleans public schools impacted the equity of the pandemic response for high school students and teachers here in New Orleans? And so my hypothesis is that student and teachers' needs and supports will vary greatly by individual school and charter management organization. And the reason is because we don't have a shared set of policies that most schools and charter management organizations, that's like what you would call kind of like a central district office. A charter management organization is over either an individual school or a group of schools, like KIP, for example, would be an example of a CMO. And we don't have a shared set of policies and practices and systems across the city. And so what students are getting, I do believe, is going to be inequitable, because what is being put in place is probably not going to be the same and have great variance. So I want to acknowledge three major limitations in my research. First is the sample size. I only had answers from participants across 23% of New Orleans charter high schools. So that does mean that there's a large number of schools that are not present. There was a great deal of variance within that 23% though. Also, I don't have any data to compare between my data set and then also with a centralized district. And lastly, some of the explanations that teachers gave me were limited and short. It is a really hard time of year for everybody and everyone's really busy. And so I wish that I had a chance to have some follow-up conversations to learn more and ask more questions so that I could have a more robust picture. But they did an awesome job and I'm really grateful. So what we saw being fairly consistent across New Orleans schools was percentages of students who had access to technology and COVID safety precautions that were put into place. Things that we saw that were inconsistent across schools were including teachers and parents in the decision-making process, special education services, COVID reporting, and grading policies. And so I want to go through each of these and share what I learned from my respondents. First is access to technology. So what we can see is that across the board, we have about 51 to 100% of students with access to reliable Wi-Fi. And it's higher, the number of students who have access to a computer or tablet. And this is from all the respondents. A little bit of variance, but this is sort of what I expected. We also saw that the COVID precautions that you have at school are what's listed on the left of the screen. But I will name that I also asked the question in my survey about whether or not teachers felt safe going back into the building, which I think is a different question than whether or not COVID practices were equitable across schools. But I do think it's important to note that 25% of teachers who responded to my survey said that they did not feel safe even with these precautions in place, which leads us to, in just a moment, talking about teachers being included in the decision-making processes. I wanted to know whether or not schools had parents included in the decision-making process. I think it's essential that we include the people who are most impacted and most directly impacted in figuring out what we're going to be doing here. And the answer is, overwhelmingly, parents were not included in the decision-making process. And I think that that's something that really needs to change. And if you look at the language of both Act 35 and Act 91, which I talked about earlier, that led to the charterization of New Orleans, part of that act says that parents and teachers being involved in the decision-making process is actually required. And we are seeing that that is not what happens. And something that I know is what happened a lot for what a lot of my respondents talked about was that when parents were included, it was more about asking, do you, did your students give a survey? And the answer was no, surveys were not given. Oh, you know what? I am so sorry. This is mislabeled. This is about whether or not we are including teachers in the decision-making process. That is my error. I am so sorry about that. And so teachers were saying they were not included in the decision-making process. And now we're going to talk about parents, and it's similar. So when it comes to teachers, one of my respondents said, the school sent out a survey, but I don't believe our input was ever used in making any decisions. This seems to be fairly consistent with what happened with parents. What you can see from parents, I am so sorry for that error, is that more people said that parents were included than who reported teachers being included. But what I was able to glean from the written responses, not just the multiple choice response, was that the way that parents were included was a survey that was sent to them, and they had the option to choose between existing systems. Do you want your student to go in person? Do you want your student to go virtual? Do you want your student to go hybrid? Rather than authentically including them in the design of the systems and in figuring out what was going to help their students be successful. And in the words of one teacher from my survey, they just weren't included. So I'd like you to take a moment to take a look at what people said when it came to what special education services were provided. And what you'll see here is a wide variance about what was provided to students. All the way from nothing was required, so SPED wasn't a huge concern, all the way to what we can see, having IEPs conducted virtually and in person, co-teachers present in virtual and in-person classes, teachers and co-teachers responsible for modifying assignments and walking through students through technology and support. And so we have a pretty large variance here. And in the words of one of my respondents, it sucked. And so COVID reporting. As my respondents said, they weren't doing it consistently. Mostly people said they got an email to the whole school, or they weren't reported, there weren't clear systems, or they had to email upper admin and it was shared out. I don't think that this is unique to schools, though. I think the challenge and variance in COVID reporting actually reflects the national challenge and variance we've had without consistent reporting and sharing the data across the board, which comes from a centralized system. So I'm not going to fault the schools for this one, because I think that this is pretty standard right now in our country. So again, with grading policies, I'd like you to take a look at what my respondents said. Again, you'll see a wide variance. All the way from your grade is based entirely on attendance to there is no grading policy, to things like if you pass the quarter, you pass. And in the words of one of my respondents, grading policies, a hot mess. And so the last question I asked was, is there anything else you'd like to add? And I think this is a major plug for the union. And I think that would be really cool that we continue to do some outreach, because one teacher asked, please come to our school. We need to know what our rights are, what protection and assistance means we have to help us as teachers. There are many cases that we judge as unfair, unethical, but we don't know the legislation. For compass observations, for instance, for professional growth plans, there are several meetings in which teachers go alone and meet several admin members who can they take with them as a witness in situations like this. And I'm glad this year is over. I'm sure that is a sentiment that many of you feel as well. And so my conclusions from everything, all of the data that I gathered, were that pandemic response was inequitable across New Orleans public schools because there are not centralized systems and policies for teacher evaluation, special ed services, and supports and grading. And that the most directly impacted groups, students, parents, and teachers, were largely kept out of decision-making processes. And so this left me with several questions. How do we get the key stakeholders, including the most directly impacted people, such as students, parents, and teachers, to the decision-making tables? What steps do we need to take to create more equity in teacher evaluation processes, special ed services and supports, grading policies, and COVID reporting? Why were COVID safety precautions enacted and access to technology more equitably distributed? And what do these data look like in a centralized system by school and disaggregated across race and free and reduced lunch? So what can we do? First, if you teach in New Orleans, if you get the union newsletter, this was included in it recently, you can fill out this survey. And I've turned it into a tiny URL. So write this tiny URL down. I can pop it in the chat as well. Give your feedback. This is for parents and teachers. So they want to hear from us to figure out what we need to address as a system, make your voice heard. And secondly, back to what to the National Equity Project, what they recommend. We must develop leaders who can transform our institutions by eliminating inequitable practices and cultivate the unique gifts, talents, and interests of every child so that success and failure are no longer predictable by identity. Thank you.
There were a bunch of questions I saw come through the chat.
Oh yeah, give me just a second to catch up on those. Whoa, sorry. Gosh, there's so much good stuff in this chat. Oh yeah, so I'll start with the first question I see, which is, did I blame AFT for poor charter schools? No. What I did is say that what often happens is that there are excellent ideas, like being able to innovate and not being constrained by red tape and bureaucracy, that then get co-opted and perverted for a really terrible purpose. And so I think it's interesting and important to note that actually this idea came from teachers, but how it's been, the way that it's been operationalized and systematized doesn't at all capture its essence as an idea. And what is happening now with charter schools, which I think I made evident in this, but if not, I will say it again, is what is happening in New Orleans is that the community does not have a voice. Teachers don't have a voice. Teachers are not protected, and amazing things that need to be happening for kids we can't do because of what's happening with charter schools. And they very intentionally overwork people. They very intentionally keep us separate. They don't let us unionize. And that is a major problem with charter schools. I don't think what Shanker's vision was what has happened. I think if you read a lot, I've actually in my research, I read some more recent interviews and things with him as well. And I'm happy to send people those links, but this is not what he intended. This is a really perverted version of what he was hoping for. Yes, thank you. I also want to highlight something Dave said in the chat, which was for Act 35, with the SPS score being raised so more schools could be taken over, by the state, that was only for New Orleans. That was not applied to the rest of the state. And so basically it was disaster capitalism. I know we keep talking about capitalism being at the root of the all evil. In many ways it is. That's a shout out to you, Maggie. And people came in and capitalized on a natural disaster and people who were in a really tough situation. So, yep. So about the question about equity, the reason I talked about like how I'm using the word equity is because all words can be used really differently. And I wanted to make sure I was super clear about the terms I'm using. Because if we're not clear about the terminology we choose to use, then we're having a conversation about different things. And I want to make sure that everyone here understood what I meant by equity, because I know that there are different definitions of lots of different words that we use in education and in teaching. The data I got were all surveys. I surveyed, I ended up unfortunately having only 10 respondents across 23% of different schools. And the data was self-reported by the teachers at those schools. What I would love to do in the future is be able to also survey parents and learn more about it. And I think actually like I'm going to pass that off to Tulane University, to the Trauma Informed Schools Collaborative, who's already doing that work, and it will be able to reach a wider number of people. And I also wish I had more respondents, and I recognize as I named that was a real limitation in my research. So I want to also share, Amber, how can we properly document issues at work? So I am in the middle of something challenging at this moment, and I've learned a ton about what to do. If you are having challenges you'd like to document and challenges you'd like to raise, I would love for you to reach out to Colette Tippy, our lead union organizer at UTNO, and she will walk you through what to do, which is what I will be doing anytime I continue to challenge the status quo and do what's in the best interest for kids who are my North Star. So I learned that this week. Talk to Colette. She will help you strategize and connect you with our lawyer, Larry Samuel, if you need it. And also just to make sure you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's, so to speak. Oh, Ramisha, could you send that to our listserv? Or is that in the union thing, in the union email?
It actually wasn't. My principal actually sent that out, and I signed up from a link that she gave. I will find that link and send it out again. And yes, they are going to the second round. I just assume everybody knew about it. They will have a second set of meetings. I want to say that start on June 2nd, or I know they rescheduled mine for June 2nd, I guess to maybe talk about some of the results. But in the aggregate that I was with, it was educators, administrators, community members. It was very informative, but again, even though we had maybe 3 or 4 teachers in that particular meeting, I'm going to always say that teacher voice needs to be everywhere all the time. And, you know, as teachers, we have to get out there tired, not enough time. If we don't start shouting it from the rooftops, we're going to always be pushed aside and disregarded.
Amen. Absolutely. And I just want to also touch on what Ms. Loria said about charter school, about unions in New Orleans. We have some of our charter schools who have unionized. And if you live in New Orleans, it is really important that you show up on the 28th for Bay United Bricolage Academy educators as they are working towards their union. We meet at Pagoda Cafe at 7 a.m. So come out before they go in for their vote. It's next Friday.
Road trip, Broward folks. Let's go.
All right. So if anyone has any other questions, I would love to hear them. Ms. Aloria, thank you so much for your support. Like, I am so grateful to you for this whole experience and how flexible you've been with me throughout the several months, and also knowing what a challenging week it's been, for just giving me that extra support. It means a lot. Yeah, Rebecca, sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm talking and I need to remember to unmute. I spend all day telling my kids to mute and unmute, and I don't do it. You were saying about that one school this Friday, you want them to go together and everybody show up. Does that mean every charter school will have its own union if they all do it? You can't come under one union?
So they're going to be under UTNO, I believe. I'm actually going to pass this question to Ms. Aloria because she can probably answer it better than I can.
So how will that work? Okay, are you muted?
No, I'm tongue-tied. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm gonna mute.
Because the schools are operated by a charter management group, whether it's a network or an individual school that it operates, the charter operator recognizes the union for the school or schools it operates. So that's why organizing and unionizing in New Orleans at this time has been so difficult, because we don't have one group that operates all of the schools. So each school has to petition to its operator to be recognized as a union, which is why, I don't know if you saw in the chat, we currently have 2 schools that have recognized unions. The school that I worked at and retired from, we had a union. I was part of our school's organizing and bargaining committee, but the charter board that operated that school lost its charter. And so the union contract that we had was between our union and the chartering board. So they don't have a contract right now. And then Bay United is working towards their recognition, which is their vote is next Friday.
So this seems to be a very cautionary tale that as Floridians continue to flirt with charterizing their systems, and with our current Commissioner of Education, Richard Corcoran, having his hand in the charter system, it does sound like from the one app to the dismantling of organization that the charter system is here just to harm education.
One more thing I want to add, that I got a direct message in the chat. We do have one other school that has a recognized union. They just don't have a contract yet.
I feel like, I know I always say this, but I just want to say it again. As a pre and post Katrina teacher in New Orleans, I think, especially just listening today, I think a lot of light has been shed on the fact that it's really, it's not the whatever chosen system is not the problem. It's the way it's done, and it's the people that are in charge. And I think that's why, us speaking up and doing all that we can do, besides showing up every day and being great for kids, is essential, because it's the leadership and the policies. It could be, any system could work if we actually make it work.